Senate. We need to get together to learn more, the real facts, not the emotional facts, not the angry facts, but the real facts. And then put that in our mind. And then we speak to our representatives, Congress, local governments, state government, and tell them what they should be doing. So it's a simple vision. It's very exciting. Now, with that, I really introduce our speaker, who's a good friend of mine. We're both very active in the Carnegie Foundation. He is one of the most people I know, and he's very generous coming down for a third year. Each time he comes, people say, we want him again next year. And unfortunately, as he was thinking about coming down, so he couldn't come. So he said he'd like to talk to us on the screen. We've never done this, so with me tonight is this experiment, and I'm so happy here. And basically, after he finishes, there will be time for some questions. So I'm very happy to hand the program over to my good friend. All right.
Good to go, Nick.
Good to go. Very good. Thank you. Sorry, we had an interruption of sound there for a moment. Again, I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person, but this reflects some of the changes that we're going to be discussing tonight. The change that the global system is going through, geopolitically, geoeconomically, but also environmentally. For the first time in a long time, public health matters to travel. That until 2 years ago, with a few exceptions, with a few places in the world that were under a health mandate, there was no sense that not feeling well or feeling a little under the weather was no bar to travel, no bar to connectivity. We have returned since the launch, since the start of the coronavirus pandemic in 2020, that 2 little strips on a home health test are enough to potentially invoke a whole set of protocols. So in my case, I'm still just at the end of the Rhode Island mandated quarantine process when one tests positive for COVID, regardless of symptoms. And this is just part of the new realities that we now deal with. We deal with the reality that travel can be interrupted. We deal with the reality of new technologies that were present for many years, but not very well utilized in terms of teleconferencing, telepresence, to be able to virtually assemble or to virtually convene. And these are part and parcel of the changes that have begun to define the third decade of the 21st century. The pandemic, and perhaps last year, those of you who were attending the talk, I referenced a concept called the polypandemic, a concept being developed and worked on by the Munich Security Conference, and that we're moving into an era where we don't have a series of isolated problems that we just deal with separately, that all of these problems and challenges begin to reinforce each other. They begin to work in tandem. And just when you think you might have a solution to one, you have others to deal with. And certainly the question of pandemics, of global health, linked to that, we've passed, in this past year, we have officially passed the 8 billion mark of population for this planet at a time when increasingly more people around the world expect a certain standard of living. No one is content to remain poor if they can afford not to. And so we are seeing, alongside the pandemic, we are seeing the strains of a food crisis, a fuel and energy crisis, a fresh water crisis taking place against unusual weather patterns. Certainly a dramatic past year since I spoke to you last January to this year, some very dramatic weather in the United States and around the world as the climate becomes more unstable. In some cases, this has led to problems with food, with harvests. Ironically, for Europe, the fact that it is a much warmer than expected winter has taken away some of the impact of the Russian energy weapon in Europe, because Europe is using less energy because it's warmer than expected. At this point last year, the Russian calculations were that by this point, the European countries would have to be revisiting their support for Ukraine because of reduced energy purchases from Russia because of the various sanctions and counter sanctions. And as it's turned out, warmer weather, warmer than expected weather, has led to the energy weapon being perhaps less effective. Of course, when we met last year, we had indications that a conflict over Ukraine was brewing, that the Russians were preparing for a variety of scenarios, and in February decided to, for the first time in Europe since the 1990s, and really for the most destructive conflict in Europe since the Second World War, to resort to conventional military force to try to achieve on the battlefield what the Kremlin could not achieve in terms of negotiations or at the bargaining table. This is, again, is unprecedented to have this level of conflict in Europe for this amount of time. And again, for the first time in a long time, really since the 1980s, the first time that we have an active conflict in which the specter of nuclear weapons hangs over us. That Russia is a nuclear armed power. It is contesting in Ukraine with an alliance which itself has nuclear guarantees for its members. So the United States, the United Kingdom, France, all being nuclear powers. And this has really put us onto territory we have not been. If you think of the conflicts the United States has been involved in over the last 20 years, we have been involved in counterinsurgencies, we have been involved in actions in the Middle East, where we did not have to worry about a miscalculation leading to a spiral, an escalatory spiral that could end in the use of nuclear weapons. We have returned over this past year to a situation familiar during the days of the Cold War, where a conflict and the role that the United States and its allies are playing in this conflict must be carefully modulated, both on the one hand wanting to aid Ukraine, but on the other hand wanting to avoid creating an escalatory spiral where you might have the use, at least, of small scale, small yield nuclear weapons of a type that have never been used before, but that is now a threat that we are dealing with, and that's somewhat new territory or old territory being revisited again. We are in the midst of an unprecedented fracturing of the global economic system. We talked a bit about this last year. We talked a bit about fractured globalization, but the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has been to accelerate the decoupling of Europe from Russia. If you think about how much European economies 2 years ago were depending on Russian sources of natural gas, oil, coal, rare earth metals, titanium, that Russia was key to Europe's plans for an energy transition in terms of producing clean hydrogen that over time would replace the use of natural gas. All of that is now interrupted as Europe decreases what it purchases from Russia. 2 years ago, Russia's economic development strategy was predicated on its ability to buy goods and services, particularly from German and Italian and French companies. Much of that trade is now interrupted. Of course, there is trade going through third parties. So Europe may not be buying as much energy directly from Russia, but they're buying it from third parties like Turkey or India. If we look at some of the trade statistics, some of the European companies that have stopped selling goods to Russia are selling them to countries like Armenia or Kazakhstan, who are then re-exporting them to Russia. But it's a very profound shift. It's the first time really in 30 years that a major global economy, in this case Russia, which was the 11th largest economy in the world, is literally breaking and fracturing away from its Western trading partners. It's joining Iran, which has been under sanction now for many years. And we are seeing also alongside of that, as people begin to reevaluate trade and dependencies, we have a new sense of vulnerability about supply chains running through China. So we, the United States, the Netherlands, Japan, and other countries are consciously trying to disconnect at least some of our trade from China. Simultaneously, China is trying to insulate itself from potential disruption of trade with the United States by shifting to other currency, shifting to new supply lines. And really, for the first time in 30 years, we are seeing the emergence not of a single unified global market, but really two markets are beginning to emerge. One, a G7, a group of 7 countries, the United States and the principal European economies in Japan, along with other trading partners like South Korea and Australia, a BRICS trading bloc, Russia, China in particular, Iran, and then countries trying to straddle the middle, Turkey, India in particular, trying to maintain economic and trading relations with both. But really, the world is beginning to fracture in ways that even a few years ago we thought globalization had prevented. So we're seeing this move forward. We're seeing some of the traditional dispute resolution mechanisms in the world, which were already having some difficulties, now paralyzed. The United Nations Security Council is finding it difficult to operate, certainly with one of its members, the permanent members, Russia, now actively involved in hostilities. China providing some degree of support to the Russian position. We also are dealing with some changes in the UN system that increasingly the UN Security Council is structured, and this is of course not news to anyone who attends this group, but where the balance of global power is no longer reflected in how the UN Security Council is set up. And so we now have the oddity of the world's largest country by population, which is India, which has surpassed China, which is a nuclear power, which is surpassed Great Britain and is catching up to Japan in terms of the size of its economy. Japan also, by the size of its economy, neither Japan nor India sitting on the UN Security Council, and a sense that the balance of power in the world no longer necessarily reflected in how the UN system is set up. That's also leading to questions and concerns about how we're going to find ways to mediate between these emerging blocks in the world system. 12 years ago, the idea was that the group of 20, in which all the United States, the major European economies, sat alongside countries like India, China, Saudi Arabia, Russia, as a forum where they could meet. But as we have seen, the G20 is now deadlocked because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where the Western members of the G20 increasingly do not wish to deal with Russia as long as it's engaged in fighting in Ukraine. But that other major power centers in the world still feel that they must engage with Russia, not only China, but in particular India, and that this is leading to complications if we're going to have a place where the major powers can sit down and at least try to preserve some of the aspects of global cooperation, given the pandemic, given the environmental challenges, given the energy challenge that the world faces. And yet we do not have a particularly effective framework at this point moving forward. Certainly, I think that the hope is that Russia was going to run out of steam a lot sooner. That I don't think a lot of us expected that in a few weeks we'll be celebrating, not celebrating, but commemorating a one-year anniversary of the launch of the invasion of Ukraine, that Russia's ability to stay in this conflict is much greater than was anticipated. Whether or not the West will continue to support Ukraine at the levels it has done so, not only militarily, but economically and financially, given some of these other challenges. And then ultimately, behind all of this is the unresolved question, and one that I think that you'll be looking at for the course of this year moving forward, is the unsettled U.S.-China relationship. That how the United States and China expect, how are they going to compete? How are they going to decouple to the extent that their economies can decouple? But how are they going to work together for cooperative solutions for those problems, those global problems that no single country is capable of solving? And some of the trend lines here are not good. We just had Xi Jinping, President Xi, in his address to the Communist Party, essentially warning his cadres to be prepared for a long haul struggle, that this is not good. This is going to be the defining characteristic of China's relations moving forward is a competitive and potentially hostile relationship with the United States, even if this is not an open conflict, and we all hope that it doesn't reach that stage. Nevertheless, the hope that we had in the 2000s and the 2010s of some sort of alignment between China and the United States that would produce an overarching framework for moving ahead on global issues, certainly that President Obama's vision in the Sunnylands process of 2011 and 2012 seems very distant now. We have flashpoints with China in a variety of areas, not least of which is the question of Taiwan moving forward, but also in the South and East China Seas, as China continues to assert its position. And all of this is laying the groundwork for an era that we are moving into, in which there's going to be quite a degree of turbulence. And we've seen a variety of ways in which this turbulence has manifested itself. Again, whether it's extreme weather, whether it's been the food shortages this past year as the conflict in Ukraine has impacted global supplies of food and fertilizer, whether it's the energy crisis, and whether it's any of the issues, these geopolitical issues, Russia and Ukraine, unresolved tensions in the Persian Gulf, whether or not the Middle East peace process is finished, or at least in terms of Israel-Palestinian process, what happens in the Gulf, what happens in the South and East China Seas. A lot of issues are on the plate, and we don't have the ballast or the regulatory framework at this point that can try to take conflict and at least steer it from blowing up into something that could become much more serious and much more of a crisis moving forward. So I'll stop there to give you just some opening thoughts and then to move to our discussion. More pessimistic now than I was last year in terms of where things are headed. There is a lot of, as I said, turbulence up ahead, and again, turbulence at a time when we are losing some of the bumpers or the guardrails, which in the past have helped to keep that turbulence from spilling out and becoming too chaotic. And that is a challenge, and it's a challenge, of course, as the United States moves into its usual election cycle. So we have a divided Congress. We do not have a unified vision, a bipartisan vision about America's role in the world. And of course, our electoral calendar is gearing us up for the 2024 campaign, which means that some of our ability to shape this environment or mitigate these challenges, some of that energy instead is going to be diverted into our own domestic politics. So that timing is also not auspicious. Even if, of course, I'll end on this for those who are celebrating, have just celebrated the Lunar New Year, the Chinese New Year, the Year of the Rabbit, Year of the Water Rabbit, as the case may be, is an auspicious year. However, so despite my own pessimistic take on this, the Chinese zodiac does call for the Year of the Rabbit, particularly for a water rabbit, which is the cycle that we're in, to be a year for growth and development. And certainly after coming out of 2020, which was an iron rat year, which was an inauspicious year, and then the challenge of the iron ox year last year, which also was a year of difficulty. At least the zodiac gives us a sense of hope as we move forward.
I think that's you heard the best response to what's going on. It's a good year anyway. And so now we have a period of questions. And so I think we'll go around the room. If I appreciate it, they have takes the technical volunteers. It will be in charge of keeping sure face. And if you please let me just tell you a few rules of the game. One is to not speak more than 3 minutes, and try to have a question that's less than 10 words. And then the third requirement is you tell us your name and any connection you have to international affairs or just life in general. So, ooh, I see a hand.
We just do this real quick. So we don't have feedback. Can you hear us there, Nick?
Loud and clear.
Okay, fine. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, my name is Eileen Brown, and my connection to world affairs is that I taught community college courses in history for many years. And I'm particularly interested in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And one thing that I just do not understand, and perhaps you can shed some light on this, is why President Biden absolutely insists that any end to this war is going to be on Zelensky's terms. The United States and European powers are spending an awful lot of money on this war. And we all know that major wars end with negotiation. And I'd like to know why we are insisting that any negotiation is based on what he wants, Zelensky. Thank you.
So the Russian invasion of Ukraine really is a reflection of long-term Kremlin dissatisfaction with the way things went in Europe after 1989 to 1991. And for years, the Kremlin has been signaling it wanted to revise, it wanted to revisit. It didn't think that the settlement of borders, the way that they emerged after 1991, that the distribution of power and influence in Europe as it occurred after 1991 was in Russia's favor. The United States, of course, and the key countries of Western Europe have looked at this and said, you know, this is the normal. What emerged after 1991 is the way that things ought to be in Europe. And therefore, we were not particularly open to revising, reopening these points. That's kind of the long-standing arc of this, is that there is a dispute. There's a dispute over, it's essentially a dispute over how the Soviet Union came apart and what has emerged, and particularly also the question of the continued role of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Europe, and the ability of countries to both make choices for themselves in terms of their security relationships, but also about the extent to which you wanted to create a stable post-Soviet order for Europe in which Russia would have a role. You've put your finger on something which is actually been quite important, has been part of this problem, is that the outcomes that different people have wanted for Europe are mutually exclusive. That there were compromises on the table. The problem with the compromises that are on the table is you have to essentially accept that that's the best outcome that you could possibly get. And no one wanted to really sign on the line. The Russians, when they were weaker, when the Russians became stronger, they were less interested in signing away some of these issues. Geography is a reality in the sense that the enlargement of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization creates a security dilemma. If you are not in NATO, you feel, and you're a country that borders Russia, you don't feel secure. If you join NATO, Russia doesn't feel secure because of the reality of those borders. When you look at the Russia-Ukraine border prior to the war, it was one of the longest land borders in the world. It was a very porous border, as we have seen, with families living on both sides, businesses going back and forth. Ukraine felt vulnerable from its end. Russia feels vulnerable from its end. There were proposals for neutral status, things of that sort, but from the Ukrainian side, they did not feel that would be good for their security. In retrospect, this war is over, particularly the damage that it's causing. People may reevaluate that, but up to this point, there was a sense that Ukraine felt it had to be fully integrated into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the European Union, that it couldn't have this kind of neutral or middle or keystone transit status the way that some of the other post-Soviet republics have, countries like Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan, which have good relations with Russia, but keep their options with other countries open. The United States and the Biden administration in particular, and this actually is long-standing. This is not something that's a new position for Joe Biden. It's a position that he's consistently had since the 1990s. It's a position that he advocated when he was running for president back in 2007. We of course think of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, but back in 2007, Joe Biden for a time was a presidential candidate before he was selected to be Obama's vice presidential nominee. the president has had a longstanding concern that if you give way to Russia here, you're going to open up other conflicts in Europe, and that peace and stability in Europe is based on the fact that borders cannot change, that you cannot have a change to the security structure as it exists in Europe, and really that if you pull out, if you agree to a compromise on Ukraine, then you are opening the door for other compromises. And again, I'm just trying, whether you agree with the president or not, I'm just trying to kind of frame it for where the president's thinking is on this. And he's, again, been very consistent about this for the last 25 to 30 years. He's been a proponent of NATO enlargement. He's been a proponent of pushing back against what he sees as Russian efforts to change the post-Cold War settlement in Europe. And the sense right now is that it is, from his perspective and that of his national security team, that it is premature to compel Ukraine to have to make concessions because of a sense that, and this is where we get to strategic assumptions. If you think that Russia is on the verge of collapse, that Russia cannot sustain its invasion of Ukraine, then you want to just keep the pressure up just a little bit more to try to push for Russia to have to accept that it will need to withdraw. And that's what's driving the president's thinking. And his thinking on this is also guided by advisors who are telling him, for instance, that the China crisis, we have time, it won't into the decade. You can put your time and attention on Ukraine and on Russia now. There's, of course, some pushback in the strategic community on this that is a bit concerned about too much of a focus on Ukraine. But that comes from particularly the presidential view that now is not the time to be encouraging Ukraine to make concessions because of the sense that only a little bit more time and you will see Russia unable to sustain its momentum in Ukraine. Now the question is will he revisit that come March, come April, come June, come July, if this hasn't shifted? But that's where we are at right now, and that is what's driving, at least in my opinion, what is driving certainly U.S. policy. And U.S. policy has been to carry the rest of the European of our allies along with this.
I was a teacher in Palm Beach County for 35 years teaching marketing. I survived. And my question is, do you think we're going to go from our currency to digital? And if so, what do you think about that? Who's going to have the finger on the digital button? And what's going to happen to our individual freedoms?
Yeah. There's a very good piece in today's Financial Times written by a Credit Suisse analyst talking about de-dollarization, and he identifies two factors. One is that increasingly Saudi Arabia and China are not reinvesting their dollar profits back into the United States. They're diversifying, and certainly we've seen China diversifying what it holds, including gold. But then the second point that the analyst raised is the question that you raised, which is digital currencies, which is the emergence of these, not the private sector kind of gamble digital currencies, that are somebody comes up, says, I have a line of code, I've developed a blockchain, I now have a cryptocurrency, why don't you invest in my cryptocurrency casino? But these are digital currencies set up either by central banks or by large corporate structures, which are ways, excuse me, to carry out transactions that can bypass the US dollar system. Right now, one of the really important advantages that the United States still holds in the world, and we cannot really stress how important it is. Anywhere from 60 to 80% of all global economic activity right now is denominated in dollars. People are using the dollar as their means of settlement. They're using it as the currency that they prefer to borrow in. They're using it as the currency for making their financial transactions in terms of borrowing. No other currency, the euro is a distant second, less than 20%. The Chinese currency is in single digits, in part because people don't trust it, because its value is determined by the Central Bank of China at whim. It is pegged to the dollar. There's a peg for the Chinese currency, but that is arbitrary. So people prefer to use the dollar up to this point. The question about a digital currency at some point is that if there are too many restrictions on the dollar, too many dollars get printed up over time, too many sanctions, are you going to see people shifting to a digital currency as a unit of accounting, which will be accepted because it will have claim. The digital currency will have claim on the purchase of important goods, starting with energy, right? Because right now, the dollar holds a disproportionate value because it is essentially the currency in which global energy purchases take place. You either pay in dollars, or if you pay in another currency, you pay pegged to the dollar. If you have a digital currency that is backed, that is accepted, and that energy producers are willing to accept because either they don't trust the dollar as much, or because they're worried about US sanctions on their ability to use those dollars, as has occurred over the last year with Russia. 300 billion of Russian dollar reserves that Russia can no longer access. And will you see this move forward? Now, the question about privacy that comes up with is that these are all digital currencies, because they rely on the blockchain, rely upon a non-falsifiable ledger, which documents each of the transactions for which that currency is being used. Now, right now, all you get with the digital currency is the transaction. It doesn't have to identify who is transacting, who is holding the digital wallet. But the issue moving forward is that those privacy protections aren't necessarily going to be there in terms of being able to identify who has beneficial ownership of which digital wallet, who is engaged in these transactions, being able to trace how those transactions move, and of course, to be able to use that as a way for breaking down privacy. What we're seeing, by the way, with some of the corporate digital currencies and Alibaba in China experimenting with this. Amazon at some point probably will do the same here, where you simply have an Amazon digital currency account. But of course, all of your transactions right now, all of your transactions are known to Amazon, no matter what you pay. But in the future, if you think tying together that payment record with a digital currency, it will raise privacy issues. And that's something that, again, as we move forward, bringing it back to our domestic politics, this is something that I would hope we have serious hearings on in the Congress about what these trade-offs are, and of course, how this is going to impact our privacy rights, particularly our constitutional privacy rights, in an era where you may end up with a digital currency and a digital wallet and a digital payment platform, where all of that is completely transparent to the company and then ultimately to governments.
Thank you.
My name is Pawan Sen. I'm International Connections, I guess, of India, and I ran a global business, US global business. As part of that, I had a chance to run also many countries and view the culture, at least the business culture. So my question is really a fundamental one. You mentioned yourself that the Security Council and power in the United Nations really doesn't reflect the economic power of what it is. And all attempts to increased Security Council membership have failed and likely to fail in the future. And the UN Charter has no way to really reflect the economic realities, no way to change that. So under those circumstances, is the United Nations going to become increasingly irrelevant? And maybe there might be something different. So within that segment, it's already sort of a bit irrelevant, and it's going to become increasingly irrelevant.
Look, I mean, that of course is the worry, right? That the League of Nations became irrelevant and was unable to prevent the Second World War. The UN has something going for it, though, that the League of Nations never did, which it does have buy-in from every country in the world. There is no country that is not a member, in the way that there were countries that were not members of the League. There is no obvious replacement, for as much as people may not like the UN system. And as you correctly point out, efforts to reform the UN system have bogged down. Proposals to expand the permanent membership of the Security Council have bogged down because, of course, they require the 5 permanent members to all agree to reform the Security Council. And so they have that immediate veto power. But there is nothing really on the horizon to replace it. There's certainly, and we've seen this in some of the votes that have taken place in the UN over the last year, the idea that the United States will somehow put together a grouping of global democracies, and that this will emerge as an alternative to the UN, doesn't have much purchase once you get out of Europe and North America. So countries that may not be satisfied with the UN system as it is currently set up, there's not an alternative that is out there which can gain anything sort of the type of legitimacy that you would need. And so I think what you're going to see is a kind of jury rigging of some of the UN system, efforts to try to go to countries like India and Turkey and Japan and on the part of Russia or the United States or China, and saying, well, we'll kind of try to give you some more influence unofficially, but we'll try to work this through for it to move forward. There was some talk, and you've seen this idea gain some traction in some US political circles, that Russia ought to be deprived of its UN seat based upon its actions in Ukraine, that Russia should not have inherited the Soviet seat after 1991. There was some effort to try to move this forward in the Congress. That seems to have died down now, in part because, again, there's a sense that if you were to eject the Russians from the United Nations, would that actually make the United Nations more or less effective? The one area where the UN, I think, continues to gain in influence and importance is its functional bodies. That, again, in the absence of an effective coalition of countries working on everything from global health to global food to making sure that telecommunications and the internet continue to function, and that air travel continues to work. The specialized agencies of the UN, or the organizations that operate under the aegis of the UN, I think, are continuing to demonstrate their relevance. I think that in particular, World Health and the Food Administration are both two parts of the UN system that people realize in an era where pandemics are likely to continue, and in an era where we increasingly have greater food insecurity around the world, that we need these parts of the UN as well. And again, sort of junking the United Nations system doesn't automatically mean that another organization will be able to pick up some of these functional aspects that the UN system continues to oversee. And so in that sense, I think that the UN will continue. Whether or not by the end of this decade, we see a push for, substantive reform of the system based upon, hey, the realities of where the global system is headed. We are in the middle of a historic transition where the Euro-Atlantic core, and again, not surprising that the UN was put in New York City on the Atlantic-facing side, but that as the global center of global power shifts to the Indo-Pacific, will that lead to a kind of effort to reform the UN? Maybe in a few years, we might see some of these efforts pick up again.
My name is Maria Bacinic, and I was consul from Slovenia to the United States for many years. My question is, yesterday I was with a bunch of South Africans, and everybody was talking about one thing, that China and Russia are starting a naval base in South Africa. Do you know anything about that?
I think that's, the ongoing efforts of the South Africa is part of the BRICS format. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. The South Africans feel that, and we've seen this as well on some of the other issues, that they have not gotten some of their concerns answered by the United States. And they look at where they are in the world. They look at where South Africa fits as part of the constellation of states that help maintain travel and networks. And this is a sense of saying, we feel that we can be treated as a partner by Russia and China in a way that the United States is very episodic with Africa. We think about Africa for a minute, then we forget about it, we move on. We saw this with the Africa Summit, that the African leaders that came to Washington said, we've heard all of this before. We'd like to actually see some greater commitment. But yes, it's true that Russia, that particularly Russia, but also China, is looking at really expanding its global reach. They are making, they're also looking at cooperation with Argentina. They're looking at cooperation with Equatorial Guinea as all spots to have a Chinese presence in the Atlantic. And it's, again, a reminder to the United States that the United States has spent the last century or so, we've been going out into the world. But now as China begins to continue its rise, China is beginning to think about where it's going to project power and influence. And it is, particularly for countries in the global south, China is giving them options that they didn't feel that they were necessarily getting from the United States. One other thing, I know this isn't about specifically about the naval thing, but just again, as a reminder, we all talk about the energy transition. We talk about electric vehicles. We talk about batteries. For years, there have been those of us that have said the United States needs to pay a lot more attention to Latin America on these issues. Lo and behold, what did we just see in Bolivia this past week? Bolivia has decided it will go with the Chinese consortium for mining and processing lithium and to create the installations in Bolivia so that lithium can be prepared for electric battery use. So it's a reminder that the United States, we talk a lot about competition in the world, but that yes, others are competing with us, and we don't necessarily always come out on top in any of those competitions.
Absolutely magnificent. I don't know where you would go, who you could talk to, or who you could connect with, who could give you a better picture than you heard here. And it's amazing. You can see why our board and various people said, invite me again next year. And he's right, he said, number of agencies, he noticed the picture. And I was very happy
he ended where we ended, because our next speaker, it will be in February, and I hope I have the date correct, I think it's February 21st. Correct. And it's going to be someone who will speak about Venezuela. And he was part of the opposition in Venezuela in the last number of years. And he is professor at Florida, Palm Beach, Atlantic University of Political Science, has been a representative for Venezuela, the Organization of American States, and is one of the incredible persons. So if you would be so good and you want to learn about Latin America, I'm going to give myself a pat on the back because he couldn't show up to replace Nick here tonight. So I spoke to him, I said, you know, we better do something about putting Latin America in our lecture series. In fact, maybe we should, that's what we should do for next year, because they're so completely ignored. Any other organization that deals with foreign affairs in the Florida area, you'll see very little about Latin America. So maybe you could help us correct that problem by supporting these people. And then the last speaker is going to be Robin Bernstein, who has been the ambassador to the Dominican Republic, and she's quite an interesting person. And so that's in our future. Now, before we end, a lot of what's happened tonight, beautiful tablecloths, flowers, the incredible amount of food, good food, real food, has been done by volunteers. I know Marty Street, sorry, and way in the back, former associate director of Parks and Recreation in New York, and he's provided a lot of good recreation. He did the food, what the food, put it together, and Casey did the technical work, and Douglas O'Connor was working both of them, and so many other people have been very, very good. All volunteers, all unpaid, doing their civic duty to educate all of us more deeply. So thank you so much for coming and your company.
Thank you so much there, Nick.
Oh,
Thank you,
sorry I
Nick. This
couldn't
was
be there in
brilliant.
person again, but
Half the crowd.
Yeah,
The whole room is full.
yeah, more than ever. So I thought it was brilliant. Really good.
well, thank you. No, always appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Nick. We really appreciate it.
All right, I'll log off now then and talk to you all soon.
Sounds good. I'll send you a copy of the recording.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Excellent.
Tweet stuff out. So,
Sounds. Oh, I lost your sound.
no, I'm here. So, all right. Take care.
Thank you.